This video is now in session, and today we're going to do something a little bit different. It will be a shorter video, but we're going to be venturing outside of US politics because US politics in recent months at this point have gotten a lot more normal and a lot more muted, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but partisan satire doesn't need to be limited to the United States, and as a result, today we're going to be talking about the Scottish Parliament election. And its repercussions on the future of the United Kingdom. So, in any other instance of a Scottish Parliament election, it would be relatively normal and would probably go uncovered. But this election is very special and very different because it has the ability to change the voice on Scottish independence. So to bring some context to the situation, Scotland has had a growing support for those who want to be independent of the rest of the United Kingdom, including the main part of the UK, which is England. There have been numerous polls conducted by pollsters, and it has shown that there's a pretty competitive it's a pretty competitive question of whether Scotland should be an independent country or not, and that's ultimately up to Westminster. So that means the British House of Commons and as well as Scotland itself. So why does Scotland first of all want to be against or want to break away from England and the United Kingdom? It all centers around the European Union and the wanting to gain power on themselves and to make judgments by themselves. So Scotland was originally a separate nation from the United Kingdom, or back then England, but several centuries ago, and that was in 1707. And then recently speaking, there have been calls for independence. In 2014, there was a referendum vote, which is in Scotland called the lifetime referendum vote, meaning that it usually happens within a person's lifetime. And that was a pretty close referendum, but ultimately it failed, and the majority of Scottish individuals believe that they should be part of the UK. And the reason why why many of them believe that they should be part of the UK is because they were under the pretense that the 2016 Brexit vote would go in favor of staying in the European Union, that the United Kingdom would stay in the EU and would continue to have trade dialogues with them. But obviously that was not what has happened, and in 2016, Brexit won for Boris Johnson and those who were in support of it by 52% of the entire country. And this was against the vote and against the will of Scotland, who around 60% of them said that the UK should stay in the EU. So ever since that vote, there has been growing calls by Scottish individuals to have independence and rejoin the European Union. And as a result, this parliament election is important because it dictates whether pro-independence parties like the Scottish National Party and the Scottish Green Party have enough votes in order to call for a referendum. And the 2021 election indicated that they had a majority, even though the SNP themselves does not have 65 seats, which is the majority. They combined with the pro-independence Green Party to then have around I believe 72 seats. I don't know why it took me that long for my math, but 72 seats. And that is clearly enough for a majority, and that will most likely involve Nicola Sturgeon, the leader of the SNP, to call for a referendum. The thing is, though, that this kind of Scottish independence movement is going to have some trouble, even with the majority of Scotland approving this kind of referendum. And that's because there's a law when Scotland became part of the UK, which stated that if Scotland wanted to be independent from the UK, it had to receive the permission of the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister, currently speaking, is Boris Johnson, who is part of the Conservative Party. The Conservative Party and the Labour Party, while both of them don't usually share the same views for a lot of subjects, they share the same view in this instance, which is that Scotland should not be independent from the United Kingdom. And obviously, obviously so, because the Conservative and Labour Party are mainly based out of England, and more land space, more land mass means more power, and thus they don't want Scotland to be separated from the UK. So obviously Boris Johnson would revoke calls for a referendum by Nicola Sturgeon, who vowed to call for a referendum, and as a result, it doesn't seem like a referendum will happen. But obviously, the SNP is not going to give up that quickly, and there are other ways that the SNP will try to maneuver around Boris Johnson in order to initiate a referendum. Now, obviously, Boris Johnson does not want the referendum, but his justifications are that because the Scottish referendum is a lifetime vote, that means that since referendum happened in 2014, it is nowhere near within the bounds of a lifetime vote, and thus should not happen. So Nicola Sturgeon could try to challenge this in court, in the British courts, and the likelihood of that succeeding is pretty minimal, because that kind of rule is instated in law. It is not a tacit rule, but rather a tangible rule, and thus it's unlikely that the British courts would side with Nicola Sturgeon. So another option she could take then is then try to force a referendum vote without the permission of Boris Johnson, and we have precedents to back this up with Catalonia in Spain. Catalonia is a province, or it's like an autonomous region of Spain, which is where Barcelona is. Catalonia wanted independence from Spain, and as a result, they had a similar law saying that if you wanted to call for a referendum, you needed the support and you needed the affirmation from Madrid in order for that to happen. And obviously, Madrid did not want to lose land, so Catalonia forced a vote and held elections anyway against the will, and that ultimately ended up with nothing, because when they held the election, Spanish courts and Madrid themselves discredited the election, saying that it was moot and not an official election, and that showed with the polling numbers, with a very low turnout going in favor of Catalonia having independence. In addition, you had a lot of Spanish police arresting and kicking off Catalonians from polling centers. So that made the vote all the more dilatory, and that meant that the referendum vote was invalid. So we could see the same thing happening here with Scotland and their calls for independence. If they try to force a vote, then they could expect Boris Johnson to get the police and as well as other authorities to stop the election. So that path is also somewhat removed. So what's the third option then? The third option for Scotland is to build allies, and the reason why they might want to do this is because without allies, then Scotland is by themselves and going against the United Kingdom. But if they have allies, they might have a voice big enough to overturn Boris Johnson's feelings about Scottish independence. So what would happen is that Scotland would first ally with Northern Ireland, which is also part of the United Kingdom, and also wants to be independent from the United Kingdom. So that would heighten both of their voices and both of their supports for independence. The other thing is that they could try to partner with the European Union. The European Union might be favorable for Scotland because it wants to join the EU, and because Scotland practices very trade-friendly policies. So if Scotland is able to have the support from those two partners, then they could potentially bring up a proper vote to go against Boris Johnson, and that would make the cards harder for Boris Johnson to play. In addition, if Scotland could try to reach the United States, which seems like such an unorthodox kind of thing, but it is possible for Nicola Sturgeon and for the for Northern Ireland to reach out to the United States to ask for mediation, at the very least, or at the very most, endorsement of Scottish independence and Northern Ireland independence. And it would seem like it would be friendly because Joe Biden is part Irish, and he loves to talk about Ireland, but that most likely would not be a big enough reason to go against such a key ally like the United Kingdom. And Joe Biden would know that Boris Johnson would probably not respond happily to Scottish independence and would probably not be in support of it. So that vote is also kind of closed. But with the Northern Ireland and with the EU ally, it could potentially set a motion for a referendum vote. It's unlikely, but let's just say that happens. So then the referendum is called. The referendum will most likely return positive for Nicola Sturgeon and for Scottish independence. But there have been calls to go against the independence because of trade. One of the main reasons why Scotland wants to be independent is so that they can trade more freely with other European countries. But the thing is, though, that in order to join the EU, they would have to have a closed border with the United Kingdom. So that would be pretty bad for Scotland because 60% of their exports goes to the United Kingdom itself, which means that closing the border would make those exports much less favorable and could lose a lot of money for the Scottish economy. So to mediate that, Scotland could try to then afterwards negotiate with a trade deal with the United Kingdom, and it could certainly be successful. But there are calls, but there are people who are skeptical of that, and as a result want to be part of the United Kingdom. But let's just say the referendum goes through. Let's just say that Scotland decides to be pro-independent. Well, that would then lead to them joining the EU. But there's one more challenge that they have before joining the EU, which is Spain. Spain, as mentioned earlier, did not want Catalonia to be an independent nation. And essentially the same thing is being repeated here in Scotland, where the United Kingdom does not want Scotland to be part of the Scotland to be independent. So Spain might veto any calls for Scotland to be part of the EU because they realize if they approve Scotland, then the Catalonia's calls for independence might increase. So Scotland would then have to face the final hurdle, which is to ensure that quell any fears that Spain might have that Scotland would result in a Catalonia independence. And if they're able to do that, then they'll very easily be able to join the EU and would be happily ever after, right? Not really, because they still have to deal with the UK trade and as well as being an actual independent country. So there are certainly reasons for Scotland being an independent country, but it's kind of like DC statehood, where there are so many kinds of different barriers that the Scottish National Party would have to pass through, and that Democrats would have to pass through, and they would be very close for DC statehood to happen, just like they would be very close for Scotland independence to happen, but they're not quite there yet. So we'll ultimately have to see how this plays out in the coming years. This is something that will probably take place over a decade and not over 2 years. And we'll keep covering this if any major news happens to occur in Scotland. But until then, this is the end of this video. I know I said this would be short, but obviously it's around 14 minutes. But anyway, this is the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. This video is now adjourned, and I'll see you in the next one.